welcome Andrea Chalupa to the stage.
So I came all the way from Brooklyn to be in your beautiful country because I've heard so much about Norway. In America, we have a fantasy about Norway and the Scandinavian countries generally being a paradise of peace and happiness and efficiency. And so I had to come. I had a baby a few months ago. She's 4 months old. Her name is, yes, that's right. Her name is baby Alice, because life is an adventure. And so I'm generally very tired these days, but because I'm suddenly went from Brooklyn to Warsaw, now Norway, I'm a bit tired, so I'm afraid of using technology. So bear with me, I'm gonna press some buttons and hopefully things work. Okay. Oh, thank God, okay. So this is a story especially for all the young people in the audience. The film you're about to watch tonight, I made it, me, little old me. And it was an idea that I first had when I was 21 years old, 22 years old, and I had zero contacts in Hollywood. I had no idea how to write a screenplay. All I had was a crazy idea, and I took myself and this crazy idea very seriously, and I continued to do this for 14 years, even when no one else would take me seriously. So I want the young people in the audience to understand that you are far more powerful than you realize, and you can make something like this. Maybe it's not a film, maybe it's a company, maybe it's something else, but understand that what you're about to see, it started from a young girl with a crazy idea, and that's how a lot of wonderful things have started. So my story began with my grandfather. I am American. I was born and raised in California. We all had that person in our lives that meant the world to us. And for me, it was my Dilonia, my grandfather. He was born and raised in Donbass, which is a part of Ukraine that's now under Russian occupation. Donbass, historically, has been the hotbed of Ukrainian intellectual thought. My grandfather grew up speaking and writing in Ukrainian. A lot of Ukraine's great thinkers came from Donbass. Now the region is populated by many Russians, and that's as a direct result, as we're going to see, from this genocide famine that happened. So for example, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, he went in there with one excuse saying, I'm going to save the Russian speakers in Ukraine. Well, the Russian speakers have really just populated the area in such large numbers for the last 85 years since the famine. Stalin came in and deliberately starved out millions of Ukrainians. It was a genocide. In fact, the Jewish-Polish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who invented the word genocide, he used the Ukrainian famine as the classic example of what a genocide looks like and how it works. And this was colonization by the Kremlin of Ukraine, as you'll see in the film. So my grandfather, he, as a young boy, witnessed the Bolshevik army, the Russian uprising against the Tsar. He witnessed those battles on his family farm as a young boy. He was starved and witnessed a horrendous genocide by Stalin, the famine. He was arrested as a young father and tortured during Stalin's purges and spent time in prison. And then when the hell of World War II opened up in Ukraine, that's when he escaped. He got out and he went west. So my grandfather witnessed the events that George Orwell, allegorizes in his classic book, Animal Farm. So when my grandfather, before he passed away, he left me a memoir that he wrote down in Ukrainian. And it's like reading the real life Animal Farm. And so when I graduated university, I saved up my money and I went to Ukraine alone. And I found a translator for my grandfather's memoir. And that's when I began really researching the screenplay and trying to figure out what I was going to do, how I would make my film to honor my grandfather and everything he had lived through. And I decided to choose the famine because for me, it was such a horrific event that most people in the world had never heard of. And that's part of the crime of what Stalin did, that most have not heard of this. And I wanted to bring justice to the victims, and I wanted the world to know that this happened. And people can't live in silence, and I wanted to give back dignity to the survivors of these victims. That was very important to me. And as I was researching the story, I was so struck by how Stalin could not kill so many Ukrainians without the help of the West. He needed the corruption in the West. He needed corrupt Western reporters to join the Soviet censors and say that there was no famine. He needed corrupt business interests in the West to turn a blind eye to the suffering because they wanted to come in and make money in this growing Soviet empire and help Stalin modernize their state. I understood all of this as a young girl, and I understood that I was alone knowing all this in California growing up. There were very few of us that were aware of this story. It was only if we had a direct connection to it that we were aware of it. And so I remember telling my class when I was 10 years old in California, I said, you know, I want to do a presentation, and this is my presentation to you, to the class, that when Stalin was trying to modernize his empire, he needed money. So what he did was he sealed the borders of Ukraine, he took out the grain, sold it in markets abroad, raised his money to modernize his empire, and left the Ukrainians to starve. And that got rid of them because they wanted their independence. This was a deliberate mass murder. And the story is tragic. I focused on, in my research, especially like living in Ukraine, I stumbled on a real life hero, a young man, 27 years old, from a small town in Wales, in Great Britain, who dedicated his life to becoming a journalist, and he spoke Russian, French, fluently, and German, and he was very ambitious, very hungry, and he went to Moscow looking for a big story, and luckily for us, he did not drink, because Moscow at the time was filled with with a lot of intellectuals from the West, famous reporters, writers, artists, who were all there to celebrate, live lavishly in Moscow, because they were shown an alternative reality by the Kremlin. They were shown a land of plenty. The atrocities that the Soviets were committing against their own people was being hidden from them. And the host of Moscow, this real-life reporter, Walter Duranty, the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times, the same year he won his Pulitzer Prize in 1932 covering Stalin. That was the year when Stalin began engineering his mass murder against Ukrainians. And Walter Duranty, the great Walter Duranty, his nickname was Our Man in Moscow. He translated the Soviet Union to the West. When he would go back to New York City, he'd hang out with celebrities, famous actors, famous journalists. People respected him as the voice of Stalin's Russia. And our young hero, Gareth Jones, sees through him and sees that he's a fraud and is bored in this lavish Moscow paradise and sneaks off on a train and escapes into Ukraine and sees ghost village after ghost village as though all the people have been abducted by aliens. And then Gareth comes out and delivers his big press conference, and research tells us now that shortly thereafter, when he was on a reporting trip, he fell in with a couple men connected to the Soviet secret police, and he ends up dead. And his story is buried. And Walter Duranty and the other journalists who tried to muddle the truth, cover up the truth of what was really happening in Ukraine, they win. They win. For a period of time, they win. And for generations, the famine remains hidden. Even in academia, when I started researching the story, Ukraine was being taught through a Russian lens. Ukraine was seen as an extension of Russia. So it's only until recent years when historians have finally come out and told Ukraine's story through Ukrainians. And that's thanks to historians like Timothy Snyder of Yale University, Norman Naimark of Stanford University, Anne Applebaum, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. And that's only recent. I've only recently come across seen a lot of these books, and that's now the standard way to understand Ukraine is through a Ukrainian lens, not through the oppressor Russia. And so in making the screenplay, this all sounds very depressing, I'm sure. Like, why would I want to watch this movie? Well, the more research I did, I needed hope for myself in this journey. I needed something to tell myself to keep going. And so in my search for hope, I turned to this man for inspiration, George Orwell. He figured out how to mass market atrocities to the world through Animal Farm in 1984. So what did he know? How did he do it? And as I was researching Orwell, I discovered that Orwell struggled for years to get Animal Farm published. And that was his first big book. That's the book that would go on to make him famous. And then he'd follow it in 1984. And so Orwell was so determined to tell the truth of what was really going on there. And he was piecing it together from the journalists that were brave enough to actually, like Gareth Jones, that were brave enough to actually report what was really going on, risking their lives and reputations to do so. And so Orwell fought to get his book published. An independent publisher finally put out some copies. They were very nervous about it. They were afraid of upsetting Stalin, our great World War II ally. Stalin helped us defeat Hitler. Why would you write a book criticizing him? And so Animal Farm came out just right after the war. That was done deliberately so as not to upset Stalin. And somehow, miraculously, a copy of Animal Farm ended up in the hands of young Ukrainian and Polish hipsters stranded in Germany right after the war. And one of these young Ukrainian men hunted down Orwell's home address in London, wrote him a letter in flowery broken English and said, "Who are you and how did you know what we lived through?" And we've started translating your book Animal Farm into Ukrainian, and we're going to give it out here in the refugee camps. So they worked with Orwell by letter, London and then Germany, and the Ukrainians put out thousands of copies of their Ukrainian translation of Animal Farm. Orwell wrote specifically a preface for this refugee camp edition of Animal Farm, and they used it to introduce the book. And it was a beautiful personal letter from Orwell explaining who he was, how he went on his honeymoon to Spain, the Spanish Civil War with his wife, and they were fighting fascists, and how, seeing all the atrocities in Spain, seeing the Stalinists attacking, Stalin's enemies in Spain, and how they were nearly killed too. That opened his eyes up to what was really going on in Moscow. So that letter became, even to this day, the most personal statement we have from George Orwell on why he created Animal Farm. And so when I discovered this story, I was completely stunned, and I decided to make it part of my script. Yes, Gareth Jones is murdered. Yes, he dies tragically. Yes, the truth dies for some time with him. But here comes George Orwell to continue the work. And the power of art opens up people's eyes to what's going on. And the refugees themselves, Stalin's victims themselves, rise up and fight to get the truth out into the world. And so when I told my family about this new happy ending for my screenplay, my uncle, who was there at the dinner table, he looked at me and goes, "Oh yeah, I have a copy of that refugee camp edition of Animal Farm. I picked it up in the refugee camp when I was a kid." And my aunt got up from the dinner table and came back from their bedroom and gave it to me. And here is the refugee camp. This is where my uncle, this grammar school in the refugee camp in Germany, filled with Ukrainians, this is where my uncle heard about George Orwell for the first time. So in America, in Great Britain, in Canada, and I'm sure in some other countries, they teach Animal Farm to students. The very first time Animal Farm was taught to students that we know of, at least, was in a Ukrainian refugee camp after World War II. And so when my family immigrated to New York City, they could only take what they can carry. And so with them, they took George Orwell's Animal Farm, translated into Ukrainian. So my uncle goes on to be a literature professor. He has a beautiful library in his farmhouse in New York State, but he always kept Animal Farm next to his bed all those years, and then he gave it to me. So that's us together. So I decided to take all this research, and I self-publish a book. I put this online. I do it all myself. I make my mom read the book a million times and give me notes. It was all self-funded, self-motivated, and I put this book online, and this is the book that makes the movie. This is what leads to making the movie. I don't have a Hollywood agent. I do not have a manager. I have nothing. All I have is this little book that I created. I had a friend, an artist I very much admired. Her name's Molly Crabapple. There she is getting arrested at the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was our own attempt in America at an uprising against corruption that took place in the heart of Wall Street. There she is getting arrested. Molly was someone that I greatly admired because she didn't ask for permission. She owned her power. She leveraged the power of social media to get her story out in the world. She shared her art online. She grew a following. She grew an audience. She engaged with community. And she refused to apologize for being a strong woman out in public with strong opinions and viewpoints. And she fought for human rights through her art. She's done incredible work. And so Molly did the cover. I was very honored for her to do the cover that you just saw. So when my book came out, I got an invitation from a group of college kids that found it in Toronto, and they sent me on a 2-week speaking tour of Canada, and I had a great time. I saw all of Canada, and then when I got home, this happens. So Ukrainians start rising up against their corrupt government in Kiev. And this was extraordinary. So this revolution was against unimaginable corruption. The Putin-backed former President Yanukovych, he stole something like an estimated $100 billion from the people. He built himself a lavish mansion with taxpayer money, which had a golf course and a private zoo and a private car collection. It was theft on a scale you could not even imagine. And so Ukrainians had enough. So it started with the young people, as many uprisings do. Young people, college students, journalists, they took to the streets and right away they were beaten by riot police. So I was home in Brooklyn watching this on Twitter, watching this on a live stream at 3 a.m., protesters being beaten just for demanding a better life, a life that we here in the West take for granted. And I didn't know what to do. I was so depressed watching this, because meanwhile, you had CNN reporting on Justin Bieber's arrest in Miami. That was the big breaking news, and no one was caring about these Ukrainians. And so I did something out of desperation. I could either stay in bed, curled up in a ball, overcome with despair, that the world doesn't care, it's an empty and shallow place and it's filled with idiots, or I can get up and do something. I can choose hope over despair. And I'm somebody that's actually, I'm on the stage, I'm actually quite shy, I'm actually quite introverted. I'm much more comfortable as a writer at home with my cats. That's for me is like a fun Friday night. And so I needed to challenge myself to help, do my little bit to help, no matter how small that was. And so what I did was I turned to Facebook and I created a Facebook event and I said, please, everybody who's listening, who cares, join me here on this Facebook event page. In 2 days, I'm gonna provide you with a spreadsheet of pre-made tweets, tweets that we're gonna send to journalists and major world leaders, asking them to please pay attention to what the violence against pro-democracy protesters in Kiev. Please join me. It'll be Monday, 10 a.m. We're all gonna be there all at once, and we're gonna do a Twitter storm. I had never done anything like this before in my life. I was hoping maybe 200 people might join me. Within 2 days, we had 30,000 people signed up. And this is what we did. We made this hashtag Digital Maidan, which the revolution itself is called Euromaidan, so we did Digital Maidan. It went viral worldwide. And I provided tweets in seven different languages, French, Dutch, Italian, and so forth. And it was from activists, regular random people around the world. I became so committed to doing these Twitter storms and focusing my resources on helping the protesters in Ukraine that I ended up getting fired from my media job. So when you have Russian propaganda trying to say that activists like me, grassroots activists, must be State Department funded, we must be CIA, we must be the Ukrainian Illuminati. No, we're just regular people taking great risks and paying a price for it. I lost my job. I got fired for doing activism like this. But what I ended up getting out of this, which you'll hear in a second, I think the Friday I got fired, that Monday I was on a flight to Kiev. I was like, great, all right, I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna keep working on my film. That's just a sign that I need to commit myself to human rights and what's really happening in the world. So here we had the involvement of this Digital Maidan Twitter storm. And one thing you can't really see, but Ukraine is the darkest color on this map. And what we did was we gave Ukrainians themselves a voice in 7 different languages, asking the world for help. And people from all over, complete strangers, contributed art. This was all crowdsourced. We had a shout out on Twitter from the Prime Minister of France at the time. We got coverage in different newspapers around the world. At the time, when the revolution first started, I wrote an article predicting that this wasn't just a revolution, that this would actually be war. And that sounded really crazy in December 2013, writing that. And a few months later, Kiev was on fire with the protests, and the people won. The Putin puppet was, fled town. The people won. And a week after that or so, Russia invades. First they take Crimea, and then a couple months after that, they invade Donbass, where my grandfather was born. And the reason why I saw the war coming from the very start of the revolution was because I studied history. If you study the past, you know where we're going. And it's very easy when you watch this film to understand that any government, like the Kremlin, any government that is able to do this to human beings, to take away their dignity in such a horrific way, imagine what else they can do. That's the idea. If they can do that to Ukrainians back then, what are they capable of doing to Ukrainians today, especially when under Putin, he's bringing back Stalin as a hero. Statues of Stalin are going up under Putin, especially under Putin, when you have a historian on Stalin's great terror who is being thrown into prison and his adopted daughter being taken away from him because he's uncovering some of Stalin's worst atrocities. So if they're capable of doing that, what else are they capable of? And so it was very clear to me that when you study the history and the atrocities, and it's far worse than what you see in this film. In this film, we were easy on you because we want you just to know that this happened. But if you really study the evil that was done, no film can contain that. And so if that evil is possible, if that sort of crime against humanity is possible, and there's been no atonement, there's been no accountability, it's going to continue in the modern age. It's very easy. That's just common sense. History is human nature, and human nature very rarely changes. It's the laws and the norms that we need to uphold and protect in order to protect ourselves from the worst instincts in human nature. And nothing has been done in Russia itself to hold Stalin accountable. He's been brought back as a hero. So the way I finally got my film made was through all my social media work. I became friends with the historian Timothy Snyder, who wrote some incredible books like Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, how those two mass murderers influenced each other. He also wrote a great pocket guide on resistance called On Tyranny, Lessons on How to Resist Fascism, actual practical steps on how to do it. And so Tim and I became friends through social media. He did a conference in Kiev with Agnieszka Holland. I said, please give me her email. And the great Agnieszka Holland, when my script was ready, I sent it to her. I had no other shot of doing anything. I had nothing. If she didn't say yes to the script, the movie might not have been made. I was ready to give up. It'd been 14 years. And people told me, she's saying no to scripts with big actors attached. Don't give your hopes up. And I sent her the script. She said yes right away. And within 3 years, we're on set together. And the reason why Agnieszka said yes is because this story was very personal to her. Her mother and her father were journalists. Her father was arrested by the Soviet secret police in Poland. His official cause of death was suicide while under police interrogation. So for her, this film was very personal, and she needed to make it just as badly as I needed to make it. And as we worked on the script together, a lot of her experiences growing up under Soviet occupation, including being 19 years old in Prague, a film student, when the Soviets invade, and being thrown into prison for her activism. All those stories of what oppression looks like, that went into coloring the script. And so I have to tell you that this all came together through Angels. This film, making a genocide film, making a film period, is extraordinarily difficult. We made it happen, and it was like this guiding hand. 1 month before we're in production, our lead actor at the time dropped out. We were short $3.5 million. The script wasn't done. We had no lead cast. We had to be on set 1 month to capture the snow, or the project would be delayed, possibly delayed indefinitely. And somehow, again and again, everything kept coming together. And it's because if you believe in something enough, if you're doing it for the right reasons, nothing can stop you. And you just have to keep going. And no matter what obstacles you face, if you stand in your truth will protect you. And that's what we found again and again in the making of this film. It's a truly independent film. We had no corporation staring down at us. We had no approval from anyone but ourselves. And so I have to tell you, knowing the industry these days, those films are rare. Everything's now Netflix and Hulu and Amazon, and it goes through teams of people. This is truly, truly independent. It's classic cinema. And Agnieszka Holland, 3-time Academy Award nominee, elected chairwoman of the European Film Academy. She's someone that does not compromise on her art. She is a journalist, a philosopher. She is an activist, and she is fearless in what she has to say. So understand that this film came from a deep part inside of her, and she considers it one of her best films, because this is very personal to her, this story, just like it was for me. Here we are on set in Ukraine. This is one of the extras. We had extras on set who would break out into tears because they all had family in Ukraine that had lived through this. Here is an excerpt from my grandfather's memoir. In the 14 years of working on this screenplay, a scene taken directly from my grandfather's memoir of what he witnessed of a live child, a little infant, trying to wake up his mother who was lying dead on the road, like pawing at the mother. A body collector comes, picks up both mother and child, still living child, and throws them in the back of the wagon like trash. A very common sight during the famine. My grandfather witnessed that, wrote about it. The night before we shot that scene, I sent this out to the entire cast and crew, including James Norton, to remind them what they were doing, why we're all here. Our morale was low. We started filming in the middle of a blizzard. It was so cold, as you know, in Norway, it can be so cold, but in Ukraine, it was one of the heaviest snowfalls. And you couldn't even smile without your teeth freezing, cell phone stopped working. So I made sure to send this out to remind everyone what we were doing. And this was an extraordinary scene, and you'll see it in the film. This is what you want to look out for. This really happened. This is the oldest scene in the script. It survived 14 years of rewrites. So look out for this, and just know that this was my grandfather. This is what kept me going the entire time. Right? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so we'll do, thank you so much for your speech about how you made this film happen. It's an incredible and inspiring journey that you've undertaken. I think we will have some Q&A after the film. But if anyone has any questions for Chalupa right now, we can take them here now. Okay, then I will do it. You talk about we can look at the past to see what's going on today. And at our festival, we have films about what's going on in Turkey, we have films about what's going on in Syria, and we have some films about what's going on even in America. I've listened to your podcast, Gaslit Nation, and I think you have a lot of interesting things to say about that. Would you like to talk about the situation today?
Where? I mean, I would say the situation today it's a fact that democracy is on the decline worldwide, and it's never been a more dangerous time for journalists and whistleblowers. And journalists and whistleblowers are on the front lines of protecting our democracy and keeping our world safe. And one thing I want to say before this, I watched The Cave, an exceptional documentary on a woman doctor in Syria who risked her life to save lives in Syria. And it's very difficult to talk about Syria. It's very difficult. Because I think what the world did to Syria is, I think Syria is one of the great tragedies of our age. And you're watching this, you're watching The Cave, and you wonder, like, how do we betray the Syrians like this? How do we leave them to Assad and Putin to be slaughtered this way? And I think when you have a film like Mr. Jones, the same thing happened. The world let the Ukrainians die. People knew about this, and they did nothing. And the same is going on in Syria. So what is the point of these documentaries like The Cave to tell us what's going on? And I would argue that the point is it's extraordinarily important, because even if Assad wins, even if his family stays in power, and Syria goes back to being an Assad prison, and it's a prison, there's state-sanctioned torture. This is what people live under. This is why they had an uprising in the first place. And so documentaries like The Cave and the other one,
For Salma.
For Salma, those are extraordinarily important for giving back dignity to the victims of these crimes. Just like Mr. Jones is giving back dignity to Stalin's victims, trauma goes down through generations. Even the children of people who lived through the famine were nervous to talk about it because you did not talk about it. And as it was happening, to talk about it, to mourn your dead openly, could get you killed. It was a crime. People were forced they're driven so mad by hunger, they even ate people they loved. Cannibalism. And that's there's no greater atrocity against someone than to force them into cannibalism. And so when you have films and independent journalists like Gareth Jones documenting these horrors, it is so essential to preserving the human dignity and helping heal those who survive these crimes. So this generation of Syrians, their children and the children that come after that have survived, no matter where they are in the world, they're going to carry this with them, just like my family carried the Holodomor. And so what these documentaries are doing is they're fighting against authoritarian propaganda that tries to hide these crimes, that tries to create confusions, that no, these crimes did not happen. They try to claim there were no chemical attacks. They try to confuse you and break you down so you don't know what to believe. So these witness accounts in these documentaries, we need them. We need them because for years to come, they're going to unite people around the world to create greater healing and greater awareness so we can be better next time to stop the next Syria from happening. So somebody that studies history, I take a long view. And by taking a long view, by thinking in terms of generations, not years or decades, but generations, I take a long view that progress may be delayed, but progress can't be stopped. And it's the people that are brave enough to show up, even if they don't even know if they're helping or not. Because what the doctor kept saying was like, I don't know if I'm helping, but she kept showing up anyway. So what we have to remember is, as dark as things get, we cannot abandon each other. And we have to keep showing up and understand that the people that are running towards danger and that are saving lives, they don't think they're helping. They feel powerless too. We all feel powerless with what's going on in the world. But the answer to that is just to keep trying, just to choose hope over despair every time. And that's what I did, and that's what got my film made. And I did that again and again for 14 years. So my answer to you is, all of us need to show up for each other, refuse to abandon each other, and choose hope over despair. And by doing that, we're gonna prevent more Syrias from happening and hopefully overcome this one.
Good question here in the second row. That's...
Thank you very much for I can talk louder. This doesn't work. Thank you very much for fantastic speech. Thank you very much. But you're American. Dramatic things happen in America now. Can you tell us a little bit how it feels from the American side, what's happening in the country?
Well, I can say that America, history matters. I cannot talk about America without talking about history. A nation that knows its past protects its future. And in America, we have the original sin of slavery. We had, on the land of America, you had a genocide against Black people, many stolen from Africa. You had a genocide against Native Americans. And that was how our country was built. And there's no greater monument to that genocide, to those genocides, than the Electoral College. So the Electoral College was a devil's compromise that was created to establish the American state. It was a compromise with the southern states, and because they understood that they wanted to protect their free slave labor. They made their fortune off of human suffering. And because of the Electoral College, we've had the two worst US presidents ever that have wreaked immense havoc on the world. George W. Bush lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College. Donald Trump lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College. And so now in America, you have a very tense population that wants to get rid of the Electoral College. That movement is growing. The fight is still difficult, but the vast majority of Americans did not vote for him. And so now we're stuck with him because of the slave system. That it's a horrible legacy of slavery that has kept us with these two atrocious presidents. So now we have the majority of the country is in favor of impeachment. We have an amazing movement driven by women, driven by mothers who are running for office, never having any political experience. So in the US, we have this incredible political energy. I myself, with just a few strangers on Twitter, organized a march in the streets. I had never done anything like that. We launched it in 3 weeks, and we were in over 130 cities across the country. We had members of Congress speaking at our marches across the country. It was all over CNN and the major networks. I had never done anything like that before. So in America, as dark as you see the news, it's very dark to us. This is the signs of authoritarianism. All authoritarian experts that are well known in the US have spoken about that. That's obvious. Anytime you openly attack the press, anytime you openly attack migrants, anytime you openly attack people of color, that is classic scapegoating that was used by Hitler and other authoritarians and wannabe authoritarians. We all know that playbook. It's a well-known playbook. And so I think the hope lies in the local movements across the country. Even if Donald Trump wins again, which could happen because of the Electoral College, even if Donald Trump wins again, Americans now understand how their political system works more than ever before. Americans are also more aware of global politics, unlike ever before. I suddenly know so many Ukraine experts on Twitter. They sounded like I did back in 2013. And they're all experts on now hacking and cyber warfare and understanding that Ukraine is a laboratory for Russian aggression, and that Ukraine was one of the many countries warning us that cyber warfare and hacking were dangerous and being used to by the Kremlin very successfully. And so I have a lot of faith in the power of regular Americans who are rising up as heroes, and they're running for office for the first time, no matter how scared they are, and that's happening in every single state right now, and that's how we're trying to protect ourselves so we can survive what lies ahead.
Great answer.
I'm sorry if I'm speaking too fast, it's just my nature, but you can stop me and I'll repeat this all again.
Any more questions right now? In the middle of the fourth row. You have to flick the small switch.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting to listen to you. I think we're living in a difficult time where there's so much fake news, and that's being used as a tool to win people. How do we get around that?
It's very difficult and it's surreal. It's science fiction level fake news. And just this week on my podcast, I published an interview with an expert on 21st century digital media and propaganda. And it's worse than you'd even think. It's whoever controls data controls the world. So you have the big Silicon Valley giants like Facebook that are complicit in the fake news phenomenon. And it's quite oppressive and dangerous, and it really does work. They had weaponized propaganda that was driving out authoritarian-leaning voters in 2016. They did the same in Brexit. And so the anecdote to that is what we did with Digital Maidan, just regular people fact-checking and speaking truth to power. Even journalists can become corrupted, as you'll see in the film, as is happening today in America. There have been some credible journalists that have published some horrific things because they want to protect their access to power in the White House. And it's important to call that out. So part of our civic duty as voters is not just voting, not just running for office, and not just showing up to events where you can talk to your political officials directly. You also have to be engaged and fact check people. It's very simple to fact check, and always look at the source of information. Just take a moment to understand what is the source, and who is the person saying this, how can I trust it, are there other sources out there? So it's just like, think about how I don't know whether you have this issue in Norway. In America, we have the issue of horrible food, processed food, so we pay more to get organic produce. So it's just like you have to think of good news, good information as organic produce. You may have to pay more for it by searching for it or paying a subscription to a credible news outlet, but it's worth it. You want to be careful what you put in your body. You want to eat good food, pay more for good food. You want to be careful what you put in your brain. It's the same thing.
Can I ask, because in Norway we're pretty spoiled. We mostly have a non-corrupt media, but it's also, we know that people are paying to spread false news, and I think the challenge is maybe making people that they just want to see everything black and white, so to just make them understand that they need to be more critical, and I think that's a big challenge, because people that are open, they will, or understand how this works, they will keep looking, but those who don't, those are the ones that are tricked.
Yeah, you should never be intimidated by those who are tricked. You should never think that they outnumber us, because even a small group of people can make powerful actions to stand up for the truth. And a lot of good movements in history have come from that. All good movements, like Martin Luther King in the South, the civil rights movement was a bloody battle. It was fiery. People lost their lives. And there was a lot of horrible stuff written about Martin Luther King, that he was a radical, that he was dangerous. And he stood in his truth and he kept going. So never be intimidated that there's this fake news machine and that there's people who are stupid enough, selfish enough to fall victim to it. You can, even if they outnumber you, if you stand in your truth and you show up and you fight for what you believe in, the truth always prevails. This is a story about how the truth cannot be killed. They killed Gareth Jones. They silenced him, I'm sure. And along comes George Orwell. And George Orwell he wrote a beautiful essay called The Freedom of the Press. And he wanted this to be the introduction to Animal Farm. But his publisher, who was nervous about publishing the book because it might upset Stalin, said, no, let's not do that. But if you read The Freedom of the Press, it sounds like it was written today about exactly what you're talking about. And it's all about self-censorship. That is far more dangerous than the bot machines, because the bot machines, there's now become a whole industry to catch them and expose them. So we are evolving to be monster catchers. But what is far more dangerous than that is the self-censorship. Because what authoritarians do is they bully and they harass and they hit you with death threats. They try to hack your email. They humiliate you. They do all of this deliberately, not just against you, not just to silence you, but so that no one else dare come forward. I just talked to a journalist from Belarus, and I asked her, are you going to go back to Minsk? Do you feel safe? And she's like, I don't feel in danger. What I fear is self-censorship. Because when you live under that immense pressure, it's insidious. You start thinking, why bother? Maybe I should tone this down. Talk to journalists, real, true journalists from Russia. They have to decide, do we publish this or not? Who could be killed? What could they do to our family? It's the self-censorship that is far more dangerous than the bots and the data. Thank you.
One question over there.
Hey, very interesting listening to what you have to say. One question that comes to my mind is, from the moment you got the letter from your grandfather.
The memoir.
Yeah, the memoir. And within those 14 years of making this movie, how much have you changed?
I'm gonna cry, it's such a nice question. I don't know. It's funny because I was a rebel then, and I'm a rebel now, so that's a really good question. I think I'm filled with much more hope. I think in the very early period, I went to Ukraine to disappear. I worked my first job out of college. I was a community organizer. I tried to stop the world from having a second term of George W. Bush. I knew he was very dangerous and he needed to be stopped. That was an election that he won. Some say he stole it, again, like he did in 2000 in Florida. And so I went to Ukraine with my grandfather's memoir because I wanted to disappear. And I was ready just to not be heard from again. I was so sad. And one thing that I noticed is that when I disappeared to Ukraine, and I had so much help from the Ukrainians that I met that were filled with so much hope, and were doing extraordinary things to strengthen their democracy. And I was reminded that if they can do so much with so little, well, what is my excuse? And so I kept fighting for what I believed in. And when I went home to the US, I saw that my friends that refused to disappear, that chose hope over despair, they were building great things. Some of their great things would go on to help get Obama elected. So you have to understand that with everything going on in the world, it is your choice to let it break you. So many people that came before you, that you're now benefiting from their work, they chose not to be broken. They chose to keep going, no matter how dark it was. And understand, if you go into a dark room, it's completely black. What happens if you strike a single match? What does that little light do? You can suddenly see. So no matter how dark it gets, just find your light, be that light, choose the light, because the light makes the darkness go away. The light is always stronger than the dark. So never forget that. And so I would say that I changed because I was reminded again and again and again to stand in your light, and that light is far more powerful. It can never be defeated.
Thank you.
A little talk after the film, after you've actually seen the film. But I want to thank you so much with your busy schedule, with this really emotional subject, that you took your time to come here. and also give us some inspiring words about hope and courage, because it's tough films we see here, and it's exactly that we need.
Yeah.
So thank you so much,
Thank you.
and I'll see you later.
Thank you so much. Thank you for watching my film. Woo! All the films that we've all watched throughout our lives, and you see the credits roll up, and you're like, credits. I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh, there's that guy, oh, that guy who had a great lunch that one time. Like, it's so funny, all the stories behind the little credits that go up.
Yeah, we're very. You should always let it go to the end.
Yeah,
You should
yeah,
never
really.
walk out before the credits.
Every single name is a story.
Definitely,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of stories
Yes.
behind this
Yes.
as well. It's hard to say what can I ask you right now, but one thing that I would really like to know is often when you write a script, you pass it along and you get it back as a film.
Yes.
But as I understand it, it's pretty different because you wrote the script, but you've also produced the film, and you've been on set. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so there's a famous saying, I forget who said it, that a script gets written 3 times, first by the screenwriter, then again on set, and then the 3rd time in the editing room. And that was, of course, what happened here, I think, on every film. I would say every single phase of that has its own epic story. The development process, my script started off quite short. I think it was like a 90 or so pages. And it was everybody coming in with notes and feedback. Agnieszka Holland, I had the best notes by far because she's Agnieszka Holland, but we did struggle with some money people that dangled a lot of money that we desperately needed in front of us and tried to force script notes on us. And the one section that we fought for, like really, we're talking yelling, the one section we really held sacred was Ukraine. So out of the entire process of development, dealing with all we had some horrific money people that we simply did not let on the project. As much as we try to make it work, the trick to filmmaking is everybody must be making the same film. You cannot say, oh, I like this story, I like this. No, rewrite everything. That will never work. The financiers that finally saved the project had 0 script notes. 0 script notes. They just trusted us and the team, and they saved us. But we did go through some bumps with people really trying to rewrite stuff, and I think we did add in some stuff to try to win them over and try to compromise. But the one part where we went to war over was you will not touch the Ukraine section. So I would say that the Ukraine section is the most authentic to what Agnieszka Holland first read. And I think the Act 1, trying to explain to people the time and the place and who Gareth was and all the BS character development you have to do. I think we did add a bit more there. When it came time to production, you are bound by the laws of physics when you're producing a film. So we had happy accidents, tragic accidents, all types of accidents that would ultimately dictate what would happen that day and what got cut. And what Agnieszka Holland did that was extraordinary, which I think every storyteller should take with them, is that she was always adding energy. She was very big on energy. She would tell James Norton, light this on fire, and you'd be, what? Okay, I'm suddenly lighting this on fire. So you saw the fire. That was Agnieszka adding energy, and she would take my 2 men, Walter Durante and Gareth Jones, sitting across from each other playing mental chess, and she'd be like, you're gonna now walk, and you're gonna have these crowds, and so she's always throwing these energy and action, and that's saved the project. And made a tremendously big difference. And then in editing, it was just war. It was like me versus Agnieszka. And Agnieszka had Final Cut, which I originally fought for as a producer, and then I later regretted as a screenwriter in the editing process. But we are still talking to each other. And that's typical for any film. The issue is, I'm a huge Agnieszka Holland fan. I watched Europa, and I thought that's a film that burst fully formed from Zeus's head. It was so perfect. And I thought I would love to do anything like that, never imagining I would ever meet her or work with her. So obviously I had a tremendous amount of trust for her, but at the same time, I have authority issues. So at the same time, I would challenge her, almost like sport, on set, and and it was quite funny, and I learned a lot from her, and she's just the most gracious, generous person.
I'd say the war between you two are probably the only good war.
Yes, exactly. A war for good. Yeah.
Definitely. You told me the authentic stuff in Ukraine, and you really feel that. What I also love in the film, what she does with the city of Moscow, is almost like expressionism with the red sky, all the skyscrapers and all that. That really gives it this film, like like an art film vibe to it, while telling such a strong story about that theme. So you should tell her that.
I will, of course. Well, she knows.
She knows. She's so good. She wins awards.
I would always say, she would get something. We would have a huge fight. I would just, like I said, I used her as a sparring. The boxing term. She's like my sparring partner on set. So I would always challenge something if I didn't feel fully convinced, and she'd always shut me down. And I'd be like, "Okay, Agnieszka, you're right." And she's like, I said, you're always right. And she's like, I'm not always right. I'm mostly right. So she knows, but I'll tell her anyway.
I think we'll open for a question or two from the audience. If anyone wonders, there we have one.
I can just speak loud.
No, take the microphone.
Okay, I'll take the mic.
Thank you.
So when you say the people who were financing your project, what was something they would change? Like, was it political or?
No. So the ultimate financiers that saved us, no changes, no changes. But the people that tried to come in, and I have a great. Do you want to finish your question? I cut you off because I have a great story.
No, just go on.
Okay, so we came across this film fund in Europe that really loved the project, wanted to be a part of it, and we had like maybe €1 million or so at stake if we could just all get along when it came to the script. And it was getting so frustrating for me at Agnieszka, really frustrating, because her notes were just terrible, but their intentions seemed good. And Agnieszka said something really funny. She said, why don't we show them a communist version of the script? Because in communism times, she would do one script for the censors and then go out and shoot another script. And they never said anything. And so she said, we'll just do a communism version. And so at one point we had a communism version. We're gonna just show them and then shoot something else. And the most extraordinary thing happened. I came to set one morning and I was told, I had all these assistants, I had all production managers waiting for me, like a group of people waiting for me. That's always scary. And I was told that the actor Joseph Mollet, who played Orwell, refused to do the scene that day as it was written. And as a screenwriter or producer, you don't want to hear that ever, it's terrifying. And so I went to his dressing room to find out what the issue was, how we could fix it. And we were on a very tight schedule. We needed the actor to act that day, and he's a tremendous actor, and so obviously this is a bit of a crisis. So it turned out that somehow he had gotten the communist pages for that day. So the stupid toned down version that was weak and empty that we wrote to please a film fund, he got it. And he goes, I would have never said yes to this project. This is how it was written. And so we had to go back to the original version somehow. So Joseph Mollet was standing up for my work. So he as an artist was validating my work. And I think that was the whole lesson of this, is just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean you necessarily have taste. And that goes for institutional film funds that do this for a living. I think in any project, you have to trust the team. If you have a team, there's a chemistry there. And if that team has a track record, as Agnieszka Holland does, then you have to trust that. And you have to trust, and we finally, the financiers that went the distance with us, they trusted us. They trusted the team. They let us do what we needed to do. And what we had was total freedom. And it's rare these days because the industry's changing a lot. These
types of films, like what we call the middle films, the things that are not a Marvel film or not a super art house films, those barely exist anymore. So it's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
Let's do one more question because we're a little bit over time, unfortunately.
How does it feel to actually have this published and now people watching it
great, I might add.
Thank you so much. I was thinking about that tonight. I was like, oh my God, it's out there. This is it because it's been so much work, and I think this is finally it's starting to sink in that it's yours now. It's not just mine. It's not just me alone in my bedroom dragging myself to do yet another draft, having no idea if any would ever read it. And so now the film belongs to you, and it's going to take on a life of its own, and who knows who's going to see it and what that might do and how that might inspire them. I mean, it belongs to all of you now. So it's exciting.
We'll let that be the final note on this. And I can tell you that this film will have a Norwegian premiere in March, I think, next year. So tell a friend, make people go see it, because it's a great film and it's an important topic. Thank you so much again for coming here. It was
Thank you
fantastic.
so much. It was
And thank you.